Hey YouTube, here's a conversation I had with Louise, who is a CrossFit athlete and coach. She followed the Breathway Respiratory training program for 10 weeks. She actually started it again now, so she's on week 12 in total. And we have a little catch-up call about respiratory training, what she felt had improved in her practice, her control, and how she felt the transfer happening from the respiratory training into her day-to-day practice. Without any further ado, here's my chat with Louise. Hey Louise, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Fantastic. It's great to have you back on the channel this time. So for those who haven't seen our podcast that we did together, I recommend that you guys go check this out first so you can learn a bit more about Louise and her domain of expertise. On a slightly different topic, Louise has been following my respiratory training program with the Breathway Better. You actually finished the first cycle. You did the 10 weeks, right?
Yeah, I'm on week 12 now, I think.
Good. So you restarted the 10-week cycle, and we're just doing a little update video to talk about respiratory training, something that, have you practiced respiratory training in some form or another in the past?
No, not at all. This is my first time to respiratory training.
What brought you to it? Why did you get interested in it?
So I've been getting deeper and deeper into energy systems training in general, and sort of trying to get past the layer of we're just doing workouts because we think they work, into trying to understand why certain workouts work, and sort of got into this idea about specific limiters for performance. And that's where I ran into sort of dissecting and understanding the different drivers of performance. And one of those was respiratory. And I really felt like I had absolutely no knowledge about it beyond sort of the 10,000 foot. So that was my starting point, was just I wanted to understand from my own learning, and also in order to better be able to coach clients, what is respiratory training? I heard about sort of the Wim Hof style and some of these kind of more hyped types of training, your breathing, but I always found that when I looked into the science, I was quite unimpressed with some of the stuff they were saying and how they were making their claims. So yeah, this is really my first time, and I was really coming from the performance side of things.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm actually building a course right now on the respiratory system and respiratory training. And one of the things that stuck out in the process is that there's really a lack of holistic understanding of respiratory training, right? Like you said, there's different methods floating around. There's Wim Hof, there's Oxygen Advantage, there's different devices that we can use, but there's no real organization of all those modalities and understanding of how to piece them together. When do you use what? And that's something that I'm trying to, a gap I'm trying to bridge. But back to the respiratory training, did you have any a priori thoughts about it before you started using the device and doing the training?
I guess my previous understanding was sort of a quite basic old school S&C coach view. So I kind of studied the fit equation, and I looked at it, and you sort of go through, okay, well, the rest you very quickly go, oh, the respiratory system is always overbuilt, so we're just gonna ignore that. Yeah. And that was kind of where I was coming from. I was like, oh, it's always overbuilt, we'll just ignore it. Yeah. But then I also heard some conflicting evidence or conflicting sort of stories about that actually in high performance endurance athletes, it's not at all overbuilt. Yeah. And now my starting point was kind of that whole kind of cognitive dissonance between, oh, it's overbuilt, let's ignore it, into, well, in practice out in the field, we see a bunch of people for whom this is really important to performance. And, there's no way that these high, level athletes would be training their respiratory system if it wasn't important. Yeah. So that was kind of my starting point, and kind of what I knew about it. I actually had no good idea about what respiratory training entailed. I'd seen some of the products that have been promoted by certain high-level CrossFit athletes, like those little devices that provide resisted breathing. Yeah, the AeroFit and the Power Breathe, those kind of devices. Yes, and what I'd kind of heard, again, from very high level, was just that people were saying, oh, well, if you actually think about it, that's not a very good way of training your respiratory system for more like general use. So that was kind of my level of knowledge, was very high level. I had a couple of people, yourself included, that I kind of trust. So without doing too much research, that was kind of where I was in my headspace. I was like, there's definitely something here, but I'm not sure how to approach, what to do. It just seems very overwhelming, and a lot of people saying different things. So, you know, I read some stuff from Oxygen Advantage, and I kind of, some of the topics I just don't know about, so I can't make a judgment, but some of the stuff I do know about that they were talking about, I felt like that was a little bit in conflict with what I knew to be true. And that I just extrapolate that and go, well, if they're saying something that I know isn't entirely true in this segment that I know about, I'm not sure I can trust everything else they're saying. So I just never felt like they were sufficiently convincing in what they were saying that I wanted to invest my own time in trying to follow their programs. So it was really when you came along with, or when I heard it, that you had a program, I was like, this actually makes sense to me. This is a coach who is into the science, who cares about performance, who's going to give me some no bullshit stuff about, you know, this is, if you actually want to get better at this for your sport, or help your athletes get better at this for their sport, this is what we need to do.
Yeah, and you talked about Oxygen Advantage. I think it's a good book. People should read it. I do think that he goes a little far in what can be achieved with the methods, and essentially what one of the main, and I always say it's the worst title to a book anybody has ever found, because it's called the, and obviously if he had said it's the carbon dioxide or CO2 advantage, nobody would have read it. They would have said, oh, this is toxic, you can't, what is going on? So I understand why you use oxygen, but it's really about CO2 tolerance, manipulating those levels through different retentions, apnea, and that's something to explore. I think it's interesting. Another point that you brought up is what does the data show? And there's this review from Jerome Dempsey. I was lucky enough to get Dr. Dempsey on the podcast a long time ago. He's considered to be the grandfather of respiratory physiology. And in this paper, they go over the respiratory system, and is it, you know, built just right, overbuilt or underbuilt to meet the demands of exercise. And there's some areas that are overbuilt, some areas that seem to be potentially limiting. And I think one of the most striking ones is that people need to understand is the respiratory, how does it go again? I was thinking in French all morning, so I'm having a hard time switching over. The respiratory metaboreflex, which is essentially when your respiratory system fatigues. For your brain, your respiratory system and your respiratory muscles are more important than your legs, even if you're running or if you're cycling, because if you don't breathe, you die. And so if your respiratory muscles are going to fatigue, your brain is going to shunt blood away from your legs into your diaphragm and your intercostals and other breathing muscles to support the work that they have to do, which is usually the case at high intensity. And that is a limiting factor. And it's obviously, it's heavily documented. This is a clear phenomena that exists in the body, but then you can't really measure it from person to person. So that's one of the difficulties. So the approach that I took with the program was to try and build a bit more conscious and awareness and control around the breathing mechanics, and also using the isocapnic Breathe Way Better device, which is a device that allows you to essentially hyperventilate at rest for long periods without having too much of a headache, versus other devices that don't control the amount of CO2 going out and going in. It allows you to do different respiratory exercises. So that's kind of what I put you through by following the program. What were your sensations getting into the program, the first few exercises with the device? How did you find it?
I found it extremely challenging to start. I've never done anything like that. I've sort of had some general ideas about what good breathing mechanics were, but I don't think I had any tools to put it into practice. And so for the first couple of weeks, it was really just it was very alien to try and force myself to breathe in a certain manner. And I was very humbled by how hard it was, how much I had to focus, and how bad I felt I was at it, because I understood in theory what it was supposed to look like, but it was really, I was struggling to get my own body to do that. My body would default into mechanical breathing patterns that sort of mimic some of my own compensation patterns when I trained myself. So really thoracic, so really using my rib cage, so really using my traps, which I also love to do when I do my own strength training. So it was really interesting. The first couple of weeks, I also got really sore in my intercostals.
Yeah, you felt it, huh?
That was quite exciting, because I was like, oh my God, I am actually doing real work here, other than just like overloading my brain, trying to get myself to breathe correctly. I could feel I got quite severe DOMS the first couple of weeks, and I could feel like I was doing real work. So yeah, it was really quite alien and quite a sort of change in mindset of having to focus on this new thing that I haven't really explored in that way, at least before.
It's really interesting that you said that. Some people get those DOMs. Some people get very fatigued from respiratory training. Some people, it goes through like a breeze. So there's really that quite significant difference from person to person on how you react to respiratory training. And I don't have enough data yet to say, oh, it's, you're respiratory limited, so your respiratory training is going to be more costly, quote unquote, at the beginning. But it's a fact that people react quite differently. I guess I didn't ask you prior to that, but do you feel, you said you felt you had some headway and some room for improvement on the respiratory side, but is it something that you felt limited you in your performance on the ergs or anywhere else? Is that something that stood out in your performance usually, or not necessarily?
It didn't necessarily stand out in my performance on the ergs, but then again, I often find with myself and my own athletes that there's a big disconnect between what you feel is limiting you and what is actually limiting you. So I do have the Moxie, the NEARS sensor. So I've used that a little bit, and it doesn't stand out to be a problem, but I can see in my own kind of patterns that as intensity goes up, I do tend to lose complete control of my breathing. And I really, while I understand what I'm supposed to do at higher intensities, I really struggle maintaining control, maintaining good rhythm, maintaining good volume in my breathing. So I was aware that I'm doing it. I was very aware that I sort of in generally don't breathe particularly well in terms of mechanics, and I do see, well, especially now that I've done it for a while, I see a big correlation between what I do with my breathing and how I tend to also move under a barbell or move in my gymnastics movements. That's some of the same areas that I feel are restricted when I go and need to do my sport, also the areas that feel now restricted when I breathe, because I've gotten, I think, a little bit better of it. I'm a little bit more aware. I can actually feel, I'm tight in the back of my rib cage, and that's exactly what is happening when I try to sit into a snatch, for example.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you're starting to see those links between what you did in the training and then those other elements. And I think what you did stood out to me, the fact that you feel like you lose control of your breathing at some point during intense exercise. And despite all the measurement tools that I have access to and all the data that I love to collect, I find that what you just said is the most important for me. If somebody ends a test or an exercise and I ask them, what limited you? What do you feel made you stop? Did you lose control of your breathing? Was it your legs? Was it your heart? And if somebody tells me, oh yeah, I lost control of my breathing, it was definitely the RPE, let's say the respiratory RPE was higher than the leg RPE, that's enough information for me to say, hey, we could probably address that with some respiratory training. And it's a fairly simple assessment. You don't need any kind of tools, but it's enough for me. And so far I've seen, good returns on that time investment of training your respiratory system, developing that awareness. And like you said, there's those two sides, right? There's the neuromuscular side of learning to control muscles and structures that you maybe haven't intentionally moved in those ways before. And then there's the muscle side, because intercostals, diaphragm, they're muscles like other ones, and we can train them and make them better. And back to that respiratory metabolic reflex, if you can make the diaphragm stronger, intercostal stronger and more endurant, they're less likely to get fatigued. And so you're going to gain in performance elsewhere. So you started, it was pretty hard. You got some DOMs, and then how did it progress throughout the first 10-week cycle that you did of the program in terms of your control, your coordination? Let's start with that.
So I think I started from quite a low level. You use this test that you put pretty much at least every other week, the respiratory coordination test. And I started at one of the lowest levels and was absolutely, exhausted when I'd done the first test, even though my testing levels were very low. I was like, I couldn't even get my head around the fact that some people can do, twice the rate or even more than what I was doing there. I found it took a little while, but towards like week 7, 8, 9, I started feeling like I was making progress. And every time I took the test, I could sort of push myself up one level. And it was stay in control. I could get good breathing. I started both feeling like it felt a little bit slower at any given level of breathing per minute. So even though I was doing the same breathing rate per minute test, it felt like I had more time to do every breath. And then I also felt as I got towards like week 8 to 10, I actually felt like I started working harder. Like I could it felt like proper exercise, and I was sweating more, but I was also able to now go to a higher level on the test and maintain good volume as the levels go up. So it's been a really interesting journey for me coordination-wise, because now I've started the program again from the beginning, but I now feel like I can maintain volume a lot better. I actually know what it's supposed to feel like, and strangely the sessions feel harder because I can actually apply proper force. I'm not just kind of going like at half volume the whole time. I'm using more of the right muscles. I still have a long way to go, but I'm using more of the right muscles, and it feels more like a workout, but also more like productive work, if that makes sense. I feel like as I do the sections now again, it's like it feels very different. I'm actually using my muscles. It feels like I'm exercising them, but I'm more in control. It feels slower for any given breathing rate.
Yeah, which is one of the expected outcomes of respiratory training, is just better control of breathing, lower work of breathing, more economy, and I think the neuromuscular side shouldn't be put aside. We have to consider, just like strength training and any other type of resistance training is going to have a positive effect on how we recruit muscles and the nervous influx that's necessary to recruit a certain amount of muscle mass. All those things are also going to apply to the respiratory side, again, just like any other muscle. So it's good to hear you say that. So if now, which is really the part that interests me the most, because training your diaphragm and your intercostals is cool, but what's better is if it actually has a carryover and a positive impact in your day-to-day training and how you feel. So talk to me about what you felt, if any, in terms of transfer from that, let's say, isolated specific training of your respiratory system into your day-to-day training and everything else.
Yeah, so I've used it in a couple of ways. So one of the ways you suggested was using the breathe rate better as a warm-up. So as part of my warm-up, getting, say, ready for an interval session, I've used it a couple of times. And I felt like that was a really good way of priming myself for how deeply I need to breathe. So when I've used that as a warm-up tool, I also felt that the subsequent session was easier. I.e., I felt like I could, at a given, say, running pace, it was a slightly lower RPE because I was able to stay in control of my breathing. So that's definitely, so that the warm-up is really helpful for me. The other thing that's been very interesting is I've been practicing slowing down my rate of breathing when I've been doing my slow work, so my long, slow stuff. And initially that caused me to panic. Like it was very jarring how upset that would make me for something. It was very simple. It was no breathe holding. It was a very like simple just reduction in rate of breathing per minute. And the first couple of times I did it, I was ready to quit. I was like, this is terrible. I must be about to pass out, which obviously wasn't true. And I found now that since I practiced that long and slow, I've also started being able to do that as I do an interval session. So instead of getting to the point where I lose control of my breathing and I can't bring myself back, and I know sort of my brain is starting to learn what are the tools we have available so we can bring that breathing rate back under control. So I think those have been the two things that I've found the most helpful. Is that I'm starting to learn to intervene in my own sessions when I get to that point where I'm actually fine, but I'm just losing control of my breathing. And because I'm losing control of my breathing, everything feels so much harder. Yes, those are the two big things.
That aspect is really interesting. It turns out that there's a very close correlation between your rate of breathing or your breathing frequency and your RPE. So essentially, the faster you breathe, the harder it feels. It's literally what it is. And so by breathing slower, like you said, you can actually reduce the sensation of difficulty and just have more control over the state that you're in. And even though we can be in huge amounts of pain sometimes, voluntarily through exercise, obviously, we can control that better, or we can manage that better if we can also control our breathing. But if our breathing kind of takes over, then we're kind of done for.
Yeah, I think one of my clients said something really interesting, because I've been working with him a little bit on his breathing patterns as well. He was like, I always thought of my breathing as an output, but you're telling me it's an input. I'm like, yes. And that's the mindset change. It's not just something that happens because of the amount of work we're doing. It's one of the variables we manipulate as we're doing the work.
There's somebody who's been using respiratory training for probably as long as I've been alive. His name is Brian Kozak. I was lucky to have Ryan on the podcast a couple times a while back, and he always says, if you don't control your respiratory system, it's going to control you. So you have the choice. And one of the fascinating things about breathing is that it's one of the only inputs that we have in our nervous system, right? Our autonomic nervous system, the balance between parasympathetic, sympathetic, can be modulated via breathing. And that's why there's so many breathing practices in so many ancient, cultures, religions around the world. The book Breath by James Nestor is really good if people want to explore that side of things. But it's true that if you can just control it better, then things usually go smoother. And back to what you said about slowing down your breathing, even on the low intensity stuff, and panicking and feeling like you're going to pass out. That's people often think that we breathe harder because we miss oxygen, but we actually breathe harder because CO2 is accumulating inside the body, and we're trying to just get back to homeostasis, to balance, and get rid of that extra CO2 that we're producing through mechanical work. And by breathing slower at a given work output, you're forcing yourself to tolerate slightly elevated levels of CO2 for longer periods of time, which can cause anxiety. But then obviously, the higher intensity you go, the more CO2 you produce. And so if you've controlled that better at low intensities first and transfer that over, you're likely going to manage your breathing better, even at higher intensities. Is that what you kind of felt?
Yes, absolutely. So it transfers quite nicely, even though they feel like very different things. It is the same, like neurological, the same thought patterns that are going on. Is very similar feelings, just obviously with different rates. But yeah, I found that if I practice it at low rates, it actually transfers quite well into my high rates, and I'm having some of the same kind of sensations and problems, etc., when I try and do it at high rates to do with the low. So it's been a nice little add-on that I can tap onto my my long, slow sessions, so I can sort of train multiple things at once.
Yeah, exactly. And I definitely think that there's layers to what we can train with the respiratory system. For me, the base of the pyramid is just being conscious of how you breathe. So controlling your mechanics. So you're breathing with your abdomen, diaphragm, thorax. How are you manipulating those different parameters? I think we can use breathing and mobility work as well. I don't know if you've tried some of those exercises too that were part of the program. I think you mentioned that you did.
Yes, I have used it. I've used it as part of some of my warm-ups. So again, similar to what happens at high intensity, when I get into a position that my body isn't super happy to be in, say the bottom of an overhead squat, for example, I tend to breathe more shallowly. I tend to sort of lose control a little bit. So I've been using the breathe way better to make myself more aware of how I was breathing in those positions. And I find that was quite interesting. It was quite hard. And also for kind of some of my stretching and just getting a little bit better mechanics into how I breathe into the back of my rib cage versus the front. We've been using them. You suggested I use them for a child's pose, for example, as well, which sort of forces me to breathe correctly while I'm in a stretch or in a range of motion drill. So it's been quite interesting. There's definitely more work to be done there. It's, again, not particularly comfortable, and at least it wasn't particularly comfortable for me when I started doing it. So it takes a little bit of convincing, but it's sort of a nice way of getting more awareness and trying to get a little bit more range and a little bit more relaxation.
From the just about 3 months of practice that you've had so far, where do you think respiratory training can be the most interesting for someone who, you know, dedicates a significant portion of their week to training and want to get better and think that this can be a parameter that can be improved? Where do you see it fitting the best within somebody's routine?
So I think it's a nice add-on because it's somewhat fatiguing, but it doesn't really, from my experience, interfere with anything else you do. So you can very easily put it in either at the beginning of a session or at the end of a session. It's not sort of causing that much kind of muscular fatigue or systemic fatigue, I would say, except maybe right in the beginning, it was quite hard because it was so novel. So I think it's a nice little tag on it. It's one of those things that you can do without much cost, but which could potentially have a lot of effects in different areas of your performance. So I think particularly for monostructural work, obviously getting more aware, becoming more aware, trying to work on that RPE lowering thing is something you can do with a relatively small investment of time. Because the sessions that are on the program are not particularly long. They're sort of like 15 to 30 minutes most of the time, with some little exercises in between. So when you put that in the big scheme of things, like, you know, I think this is a way better investment of time than foam rolling, for example. my least favorite warm-up cool down. But you know, it's a very productive way of using your time that will spill over into many different areas of training. And over time, it's like a learned skill. It's like a competency thing. So I definitely think it fits quite nicely because it is not, you know, hugely taxing. It's not, you're not having to sacrifice something else in order to do that. It's just kind of clearing a little bit of time in your day to fit this into your practice. I think this is quite easy to do, actually.
I had another question for you, because that's an area that I'm interested in. Did you feel any difference in sensation, control, or strength in terms of bracing when you were going for a squat, for something heavier? Because obviously we're training the diaphragm, we're trying to get a better range of motion in our breathing, and how you're going to contract those muscles do play a role in bracing. So I was just curious if you felt anything on that side, or if you haven't noticed anything.
The big thing for me on bracing has been just more awareness around the back of my rib cage. So I feel that more acutely, and I can sort of feel like when I'm breathing into it or not as well. So it's like a sensation thing when I said, where I'm now more aware, like, you know, simple, like when you start learning to brace, it's a very simple cueing, and a lot of people miscue you by just telling you to squeeze the front of your rib cage together. And I understood the 360 idea, but I think with the breathe way better, I can now feel the 360 a bit better. So I can sort of be more aware, am I actually filling and bracing all around, or just bracing from the front? So that's been the sort of learning for me, is like just that sensation of what does it actually mean to fill the back of your lungs, or fill your lower back, using it in an appropriate way. So yeah, it's been like sensation and awareness more than anything else, and it's just using that breathe way better and thinking about where there's some exercise in the program as well that I found really helpful about breathing into the rib cage and then breathing into deeper into the stomach, and just kind of that awareness of how different those feel and how I can use those differently, how the different areas of your respiratory muscles feel. Like that's been the big kind of eye-opener for me, sort of more broadly in my exercises, that I can actually sort of feel the backside of it more now.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I guess it's like any skill, when you start, it's just one big blob of everything mixed together. And once you dive into it, you start to dissect it, and you can tease apart different elements, and then you can control them independently. And like you said, just bringing more awareness to how you move those structures and how much control you have over them. So that's really interesting. How do you see the breathe away fitting into your routine long term? Because obviously you've done the program once. It's like you said, 3-4 sessions a week. They're not very long, but it's still a significant time investment. What do you feel are the elements that bring you the most and that you see yourself continuing on the medium to long term, regardless of whether you follow the structured program or not?
I think the coordination work has been really good for me. And that's something that I think I would benefit from continuing to do. Maybe at some point, not sort of the frequency that I'm doing it right now, but I think it would be a very good thing to maintain and continue to work on my awareness about. Mm-hmm. So that's the one thing. The other thing is working it into my workouts as a warm-up tool. Like that's where I really see it coming in and becoming something that I would just do as part of my normal training. So I think those two things would be my sort of my main things. And then I don't think I've worked enough on the like mobility, range of motion side of thing yet to figure out if this is something that I would continue doing forever. But for right now, I would say I'm still in the experimentation phase in terms of when do I use it, how does it work the best, what exercises is it helpful for. So I'm still kind of trying to figure that out. But I also see how if you're feeling tight, if I'm feeling tight in one area, or like I'm not getting into a good position, is this something that I bring with me and add into my warm-ups for a little while just to make sure I'm breathing properly and I'm using the right structures?
Awesome. Well, Louise, thank you for taking the time for that little feedback. It's always very valuable to me to discuss with the participants of the program to understand how it fits within each person's context and where you feel the most return on investment. So again, thank you so much for your time. It was good to have you back on.
Thank you for your help.
Happy training, and I'll talk to you soon.
Same.